So good to see you. Welcome, everybody. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. That's better. The light behind me doesn't help, but there we go. So glad we have a chance to talk. It's Saturday evening here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. It's really nice weather, I will say. I don't know why sometimes I begin by starting talking about the weather, and the weather has been very hectic lately. It's been very inconsistent. But lately here in Brooklyn today was excellent. It was just excellent weather. It wasn't too hot, wasn't too cold, wasn't erratic, wasn't too humid. We had a lot of humidity lately in Brooklyn, and that humidity just makes you just want to go ugh. It just makes you not want to move for some reason. It just makes you not want to move. But the humidity today wasn't too bad. Pure, perfect atmosphere. Not too hot, not too cold. I couldn't have asked for a better day. Went to the gym and worked out today. Went to the gym and worked out. Had a nice long workout at the gym, and lifted some weights and went on the cardio machine. Worked out longer than I had planned to. Got into place. We had a great Zoom call this afternoon for the Center for Political Innovation. A lot of new folks on there, full of energy. I got to tell you all what the Center for Political Innovation is up to. We've got people in Chicago now. The folks out in Chicago are doing a great job. The folks in San Angelo, Texas, they're doing a great job. They are just doing a great, tremendous job. The folks out in Texas and the folks here in New York, the John Brown Volunteers. They last week we had a demonstration in Union Square for the anniversary of 9/11, and then yesterday was the anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, and so there was a demonstration in Zuccotti Park, and oh yeah, and video of that is up there, and things are going very, very well, very, very well. Um, you know, things are going really, really well, like left and right opportunism, left and right opportunism. So yeah, things are going well. The big week of the UN General Assembly is going to be next week. We're going to be hearing from world leaders for the UN General Assembly. Yeah, been some new revelations. But anyhow, before I get into all of that, be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. The way this works is that I give my opening remarks while writing down your super chat questions. I write down your super chat questions, and then we do the roll call, and then in the second half of the show, I answer the super chat questions. Then we're done. That's basically how it works. Yeah, if you've got questions, I already got the first one about left and right opportunism. I just keep writing them down, and then I spend the second half of the show answering them. So welcome, everybody. Glad you're here. Post this wherever videos are posted. Reddit, Twitter, social media, Nicaraguan elections. All right, Nicaraguan elections. Nicaraguan elections. F. Joe Biden chance. Alrighty. And so we've learned some interesting things this week. There have been a few things that we have learned, and I just want to fill you all in. So apparently General Milley, who is the top Pentagon dude, right? General Milley, he apparently was talking to China and assuring them the USA was not planning to attack China before the elections ended. All right, after the elections, he was assuring them he was not planning to. Trump would not attack China. Have you noticed an uptick in interest in socialism and communism? Uptick, interest, socialism, communism, lives. And So now there's kind of a right-wing attack on General Milley. They're referring to him as this woke, as the woke general. They're arguing that he's trying to bring critical race theory and other, more liberal interpretations of events into military training. And they're arguing that he did speak to the top commander of the Chinese military, assuring them that there would not be an attack before Trump left office, despite Trump's erratic behavior. France's reaction after the AUKUS deal. It says reaction. And it appears that there are disagreements within the deep state. We also find out that CIA Director Gina Haspel, who Donald Trump appointed, Donald Trump's first CIA director was Mike Pompeo. And when Donald Trump moved Mike Pompeo to be Secretary of State, he replaced Mike Pompeo with Director Gina Haspel. And CIA Director Gina Haspel, CIA Director Gina Haspel was known as the torture lady. She had a reputation for defending and carrying out George W. Bush's torture policies. And apparently Gina Haspel was also quite worried about Donald Trump and the danger he might attack Iran before the election ended. Very interesting. Now, you have to wonder, when Donald Trump was facing leaving office, why U.S. intervenes in Syria. When Donald Trump was facing leaving office, why was it that there was a concern that he would attack China or attack Iran before leaving office? Well, it's interesting because it fits a pattern. You may not notice this, but Donald Trump killed General Qasem Soleimani right around the time that he was facing impeachment. It was while he was being impeached that he murdered the top Iranian general in a very cowardly way. The leader of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps gunned him down in a very cowardly manner while the impeachment debacle was going on, while Donald Trump was being impeached, at a moment when Donald Trump was particularly vulnerable. And then it appears that as he was getting ready to leave office, he was contemplating attacking Iran, and he was contemplating attacking China. And that's when General Milley made this alleged phone call to the leaders of the Chinese military, assuring them that if there were to be some kind of move, they would be informed, and that Donald Trump would not be able to start a war with China before he left office. Now, this raises the question, and it must be asked, why would a president who's in trouble, his first instinct be to start a war, right? And if you're in political trouble, why would you start a war? Why is that what you would do if you're facing political trouble? Donald Trump is facing impeachment. He kills Qasem Soleimani. Donald Trump is facing leaving office. He's contemplating attacking Iran, attacking China. But then that points towards something else. Which is, you'll recall that presidents who are in trouble often start wars. You'll remember that when was it that Bill Clinton bombed former Yugoslavia and launched his campaign against Serbia? It was amid the Monica Lewinsky scandal. You remember that? Amid the Monica Lewinsky scandal, Bill Clinton attacked former Yugoslavia. You'll recall that. Furthermore, imperialism benefits U.S. workers. Furthermore, you'll recall that until 9/11, George W. Bush's approval rating was quite low. And it wasn't until 9/11, it wasn't until, the attack on Afghanistan, until the invasion of Iraq, that George W. Bush's popularity got back to healthy levels. The first year of Bush's presidency, he was doing pretty miserably. Israel, China. His presidency was doing very miserably. Why is this? What is the secret here? It appears that when our candidates run for office, when the presidents and the people running for the presidency, the presidential candidates are out there campaigning, in a lot of ways, and thank you, Omar Jarala, in a lot of ways, they're not really auditioning to us. They are auditioning to the people who really run the United States. And the people who really run the United States are not fully unified. There are many different wealthy folks in the United States, many different millionaires. There's over 1 million millionaires in the United States, and there are many billionaires. And they don't always agree on everything. And there are different factions among them and different interest groups among them. And when a candidate is running for office, and when a president is facing a political crisis and the possibility of being driven out of office, they don't rush into action to try and please the American people. They rush into action to please the people at the top. And those people at the top are very much tied in with the military-industrial complex. They're tied in with war, and they also are very threatened by the existence of emerging countries around the world that compete with them. Iran is a competitor with the oil monopolies in the United States. It's a country that had its Islamic Revolution in 1979, seized control of its oil, and exports oil on the international markets in competition with Wall Street and big corporations, and based in the West with the big four super majors and Wall Street, monopolies. Furthermore, China used to be the sick man of Asia. Now China is the top producer of telecommunications material with Huawei. They are the top producer of steel, and they are a competitor with Western monopolies. And in response to that, it seems that if you want to appeal to the people who really have the power in the United States, the way that you appeal to them is by starting a war, right? And that is a way to prove your loyalty to those in power. And if anything, it was Donald Trump's anti-war demagogy that he talked about on the campaign trail. It was Donald Trump's anti-war demagogy that put him on the defensive. Donald Trump was on the defensive throughout his presidency, trying to prove he was not soft on Russia, trying to prove he was not a non-interventionist, and that put Donald Trump in a situation where he was constantly trying to prove his loyalty. Now, during the Cold War, it was the Democrats that were in this position. And you'll notice that the two biggest wars of the Cold War, the Korean War and the Vietnam War, were both started by Democrats. Did you know that? It was Democrats who started the two major wars of the Cold War. It was Harry Truman, Roosevelt's vice president, became president, who was being castigated for having, quote-unquote, lost China, with the House Un-American Activities Committee going after prominent figures in the Democratic Party like Alger Hiss. It was Harry Truman who launched the murderous Korean War and prevented Korea from being reunified, from having having peninsula-wide elections, and sent many Americans to their deaths, killed 4 to 5 million Koreans with mass bombing and destruction. It was Harry Truman, a Democrat, who did that at a time when the Democrats were being accused of being soft on communism, being accused of having lost China, being accused of being a party that was not loyal and was not willing to go to war enough. What's interesting is the Vietnam War started with Lyndon Johnson at a time when the Democrats were being accused of being the party that was soft, right? In the 1964 presidential election, you had Barry Goldwater, who was a conservative Republican, and you had Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson ran as the peace candidate. That's how he presented himself, right? He got up and he said, "I'm not going to send American boys to do what Southeast Asian and Vietnamese boys ought to be doing for themselves." And Lyndon Johnson had the infamous ad where the little girl is counting the daisies on her flower, and then you hear the nuclear countdown, 10, 9, 8, and then you see, a nuclear explosion. It's vote for Lyndon Johnson or else you're going to have nuclear war. Lyndon Johnson positioned himself as the peace candidate. He was the peace candidate, the lesser evil. And it was Barry Goldwater who was the crazy anti-communist extremist. And Barry Goldwater had been tied to the McCarthyists. Barry Goldwater was endorsed by the John Birch Society and by the Ku Klux Klan. And Harry Truman, you had to vote for Lyndon Johnson, because Lyndon Johnson was not a crazy warmonger like Barry Goldwater. However, Lyndon Johnson got elected, and what did he do? Gulf of Tonkin, and he started the Vietnam War. Why? Because the fact that he had run as the peace candidate put him in a defensive position. You have to prove yourself to the military-industrial complex. You have to prove your loyalty. Barry Goldwater, if he had gotten in there, he wouldn't have had to prove his loyalty. He would have been assumed to be a warmonger. But Lyndon Johnson was on the defensive. He was on the defensive, and there you go. It's quite interesting to think about. Now, there's a book that I do recommend to people if you want to understand divisions in the U.S. ruling class, etc. I do recommend the book Market Elections by Vincent Copeland. Vince Copeland, who was a Marxist radical activist in the United States, he wrote a book called Market Elections. And he follows the Rockefeller oil dynasty and their political alignment throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And the Rockefeller family, they were essential in determining a lot of the political process in our country up until at least the 80s and 90s. They're still deeply influential now, but there are other factions that have gained power, the Silicon Valley fascists, etc. But Market Elections by Vincent Copeland, he talks about how Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate, was considered by the Rockefellers to be too extreme and too far right-wing. That he was tied to some of these more radical, dissident right-wing factions, like the John Birch Society, who called the Rockefellers communists, who wanted to outlaw birth control, outlaw abortion, etc. And the Rockefeller Republicans, they were called, were these moderate Republicans. And it was the Rockefeller family and their allies that accused Barry Goldwater of being too far to the right, said there was a whiff of fascism at the 1964 Republican Convention. And it was the Rockefellers shifted into the Democratic camp starting in the early 60s. It's very interesting. It's very, very interesting. And that the Rockefeller family, they were considered Republicans, conservatives, but they were shifting leftward, and their financial interests were shifting leftward throughout the 1960s in response to the kind of lower levels of capital, in response to the lower level capitalists, these lower level capitalists who weren't part of the club. The Rockefeller family, they were the Council on Foreign Relations, they were the Rockefeller think tanks. They actually donated the land on which the United Nations sits, the UN. The UN headquarters in Manhattan is on land that was donated by the Rockefeller dynasty, one of the richest families in the history of the United States. Nobody even really knows how much money they have. When one of the Rockefellers was being interrogated before Congress, you had a situation where all the best journalists in the United States, were trying to figure out just how much money the Rockefellers had, and they couldn't figure it out. Ferdinand Lundberg, who was a journalist, he wrote a very good book called Rockefeller Syndrome. And in that book, he talks about how it's impossible to determine how much money the Rockefellers have. It's not all sitting in their own name. The money is wrapped up in an elaborate network of trusts and etc. I mean, they are Chase Bank, they are ExxonMobil, they're heavily invested in other oil companies like Marathon, and they're in oil, and at this point, Chase Bank, it's J.P. Morgan Chase, it's the Morgans, so General Electric is tied in with Chase Bank as well. And if you look at how much money and how much they control, I mean, you're talking about all of the Rockefeller foundations, you're talking about a huge layer of wealth and money. and it's almost impossible to figure out how wealthy these folks are. And there are other dynasties in the United States. The Morgans, right? They talk about they talk about the six families that rule the United States. The six families, right? America's six families that dominate. If you want to know the old money Eastern establishment of the United States, we're talking the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the DuPonts, the Mellons, right? Now, who is it? Rockefellers, Carnegies, DuPonts, Mellons, right? And who else? Who else are there? Well, that's four, right? And there's two more. There's two more families that generally are associated with the ultra rich in the United States. DuPonts, Mellons, right? And there's two other ones, and they are very, 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 very entrenched. People in the chat are saying Rothschilds. Rothschilds are British. They're not in the United States. And the Vanderbilts. The Vanderbilts are generally not included. They are a very, very wealthy family. The Mercers and Soros. No, the Mercers, no, definitely not the Mercers. And Soros is from Hungary, and he's he came to money in his own life, and he's Hungarian. So, right, Carnegies, DuPonts, Morgans, Mellons, Rockefellers, right? So Rockefellers, Carnegies, DuPonts, Morgans, Mellons. That's five. There's one family I'm missing. Which one is it? Which one is it? There's one more family I'm missing there. I'm missing one more family, right? Yeah, there's one more family I'm missing. It's not the Vanderbilts. It's not the Vanderbilts. It's not the Fords. Henry Ford, you have to remember, now he was an auto manufacturer. So there's one more family I'm not thinking of. But this is, the Walton family, for example, right? And they're not on that list. They're not considered one of the old six families of the United States. But the Walton family, they own Walmart, right? Sam Walton, and yes, that family is super wealthy and such, but they're not part of this old banking elite. It's very funny. There's a book that you can read, and it's the kind of book. It's the kind of book that you wouldn't think that a communist could take much out of it. And the book is called The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. But if you read that book, it's about very wealthy people in New York City during the 1920s. And if you read that book, you get kind of an understanding. Of who these elites were, right? So, the book takes place in the Hamptons and Long Island, West Egg and East Egg. And the rich are always driving through Queens, which they refer to as the Valley of Ashes, because it's industrial. They're always driving through Queens to Manhattan, which is their playground where they party. Optimistic, left, resurgence, genuine. I'm writing it down. The Gettys, they're a good one, but I don't think they're on the list, right? That's a good one. All right. Patriotic to workplace, not country. Okay. Books on the history of China. That's a very good question, Io. Books on history of China. But yeah, when you talk about the old money and the Wall Street elites and all of that, if you read The Great Gatsby, right? They drive through the Valley of Ashes, which is Queens, to party in Manhattan, and the villain character in The Great Gatsby, who's supposed to be a very, very wealthy man who has a relationship with Mr. Chase of Chase Bank. He's a eugenicist and he's a racist, and he's always going on and on about other races and the need to beat them down and protecting the Nordic race, which was a very popular viewpoint among the ultra rich during the 1920s. I wrote a review of the film of The Great Gatsby, the movie version of it that was made by Leonardo DiCaprio. And it wasn't really a review, and it's a shame it's not on the internet anymore. A lot of my old articles are up on the internet, but some of them have been removed and over the years. But I wrote a review of Will the Quad become Asian NATO? Quad, Asian, NATO. I wrote a review of the film, but I used the film to make 3 points. And I basically, the first point I drew from the book Great Gatsby was to point out how in the 1920s, among Tom Buchanan, that's his name. Thank you, Nico P. Tom Buchanan, who is the polo player, who's this overly athletic, wealthy man who's kind of the villain. He's dating Daisy, who is Gatsby's long-lost love. Tom Buchanan is always spewing racism and eugenics and such. And that points out how fascism was being widely discussed among the rich during the 1920s. And you would get that from F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel. It comes across very clearly. Tom Buchanan, the villain, who's this wealthy guy, is just constantly walking around spewing racism. And it's not like street bigotry. He's not just talking about this race he doesn't like and all that. It's this kind of, pseudo-academic, pseudo-scientific racism he's spewing. He's a Nazi, basically. Tom Buchanan is a Nazi. And that shows how fascism was a response, and the rise of the Soviet Union, the rise of the labor movement. The other thing that I pointed out is in the movie version of The Great Gatsby, not in the book, they didn't make this mistake in the book, but in the movie version of The Great Gatsby, they do show construction workers. Aren't the Quad already? The Pacific Military Alliance, writing it down. And thank you, Wanderer. Quad Military Alliance. In the movie version of The Great Gatsby, they show, construction workers at various points in the film. And they show, they show working people throughout the film. And it's supposed to be the 1920s. But as you'll notice, they do have black construction workers in New York City in the 1920s. There were no black construction workers in New York City in the 1920s because the AFL and the construction trades in New York City were racist. The AFL unions did not allow black people to work in construction. And I figured that the reason that when they made the Leonardo DiCaprio version of the movie and they showed African-American, construction workers at construction sites and such, that was because the whole movie is about rich white people. I mean, there's so many rich white people in the movie. They figured, okay, if we're going to have any non-white people in the movie, we got to have something. And so they put some construction workers into the film. But at that point in the 1920s, the American Federation of Labor, they did not allow black people in the construction trades. And the construction trades in New York City were the most racist of all of the unions by far, and they were dominated by the American Federation of Labor. And the Communist Party, they eventually, fought racism within the unions. But yeah, even up into the 70s, it was rare to see African-American construction workers in New York City. I mean, the construction trades, if you're doing construction in Manhattan, mind you, you're getting paid very good wages to do it, right? I mean, the pay for union construction workers in Manhattan and New York City is very good. And getting a union construction gig in Manhattan is a very good gig. And so those jobs are very nepotistically handed out. They're very protected. And it really wasn't until the 1970s with the rise of like mandatory affirmative action that was enabled. You were able to see African Americans in those trades. And the construction trades, they are a great example of the aristocracy of labor. And this is what people don't get. The aristocracy of labor, right? The aristocracy of labor, it refers to the fact that because of imperialism, there are workers within the homeland of imperialism who are able to have a higher living standard and see their wages go up. Because of where they're operating. They're operating at the center of the empire. They're able to get the bosses to pay them more than they would generally pay, right? Construction workers in Manhattan, in the capital of capitalism, the center of the global empire, are in a position where if they go on strike and they unionize, they could get the employers to pay them very high wages. Construction workers in Alabama are not in that situation. Construction workers in South America are certainly not in that situation. Construction workers in Central Asia are certainly not in that position. But if you're a construction worker in New York City, in the heart of the empire, especially during the post-World War II economic expansion, but even in the 20s, right? You can force the employer to give you higher pay. However, right, that leads to a situation where the construction workers they win that higher pay, and then they're being told, oh, well, this is because we're skilled workers, right? We're skilled. They need us. We're construction workers. But we don't think that workers in a factory should get decent pay like we get. We don't think that workers, that domestic workers should get this higher pay. We're a skilled trade. We're craftsmen, right? We had to have an apprenticeship and all of that. And actually, we're more like the bosses. We're more like our employers than we are like these non-English speaking workers who work in the factories, than we are like African Americans or Latino folks, and it changes their consciousness. And during the 1970s, in May of 1970, there was a very famous incident called the Hard Hat Riots. Are folks ever familiar with the Hard Hat Riots? And what that was the construction workers' unions. Went out to beat up anti-war protesters, and they were supporters of Richard Nixon. They were called hard hats. They were right-wing construction workers. They were part of the construction trades, and they were conservatives. They weren't Democrats. They were supporters of Richard Nixon. They were labor union organized. They were union workers, but they were Republicans. They were conservatives, and they got the day off work. Their bosses gave them the day off work, and they patrolled lower Manhattan and Greenwich Village, beating up random people for having long hair, beating up anti-war protesters. It was the Hard Hat Riots. Well, why did these construction workers, who were working class, why did they feel a need to do this? Because they were labor aristocracy, right? They got paid so much higher than workers in other parts of the world, and even than other workers in New York City. And they identified with imperialism. It changed their consciousness, and they felt that the hippies and the Black liberation movement was a threat to their privilege. And as a result, they were mobilized against the anti-war movement. And what's interesting is Gus Hall, the leader of the Communist Party of the United States, wrote a pamphlet directed at those construction workers, and it was called Hard Hats and Hard Facts. You can probably Google it and find it. Hard Hats and Hard Facts. And the Workers' World Party, they wrote an article about the construction workers doing it, and they showed a picture of the construction workers, and they had a banner that said like "America, love it or leave it," whatever. But they covered up what the banner actually said, and they wrote on it, "I love my boss." Because that's basically what they were doing. By beating up the anti-war protesters, the labor aristocracy was saying, "I love my boss." Then that they did. They felt like, hey, I've got better pay than other people. I should defend my position, right? And that's the aristocracy of labor. But I got to tell you, one of the best moments at Occupy Wall Street, I've told this story before, and we are coming out of the 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. One of the best moments at Occupy Wall Street, best stories, I guess. It wasn't a moment. It was a couple things. But I remember, there was a night that Bloomberg announced he was planning to raid the park. So Occupy Wall Street started September 17th, 2011 was the day it started. The first General Assembly was August 2nd, 2011. That was the first meeting with David Graeber and folks, which I was part of. And there were meetings in Tompkins Square Park, etc. But the actual occupation started September 17th. September 17th. And, they kept going for a little while. And it was around mid-October that they announced that they were planning to raid the park, that Bloomberg was going to clear the park that night. And so an email went out, and every liberal Democratic Party group in the country, ACLU, Planned Parenthood, they all sent this email out, "Go and defend Occupy Wall Street. Bloomberg is going to raid the park tonight." And I went there with some other activists, and we'd all seen this. The emails started going out around 11, 12, midnight or whatever. So it's late at night, but we're saying we're going to stay in the park. We're going to get to the park and be there as people, come in. So I remember I got off the train around midnight, down in the Wall Street area, and I was carrying signs with me, and the signs said "Abolish capitalism, fight for socialism." They were, revolutionary Marxist signs. And it's late at night, and I got out of my I got out of the subway, and I'm carrying these signs with me, and in a cab, there's some rich Wall Street guy who's probably just finally leaving the bar, right? He's finished his nightly drinking. He's on his way home. And he rolls down the window of the cab and he shouts at me, "Get a job, you dirty hippie! Get a job, loser!" You know, whatever. He shouts that at me. So I'm just standing there. I figure, whatever. I mean, people shout at you. You know, I'm used to this kind of thing. But then behind me, right, at the subway station I was at, there was construction going on. There were a bunch of guys in hard hats working a late night shift on construction. And they immediately started shouting back at the guy in the cab. "Shut up, you 1% mother effer, you know, you rich ass, you know, you do a day's work, you piece of crap." All these construction workers are shouting back at the rich guy in the cab. I thought that was pretty cool. So, you know, I went to Occupy Wall Street and we're there. And, you know, gradually as it's getting toward morning, more and more people are piling in. By 6 in the morning, Occupy Wall Street was full of people. I mean, it was just packed full of people, right? Because that was the night that there was a full mobilization. Trotskyism versus liberalism. You know, there was a full mobilization to defend the park. So, you know, but we had plenty of time. We're just kind of chilling there as the park is filling up. Finally, as the sun comes up, there's thousands of people there, and of course, they don't clear the park that night. It was kind of the orgasm of Occupy Wall Street, right? That was the climax of Occupy Wall Street, you could say. They did clear the park, a month later, but you know, that was the night where everyone came out and defended Occupy Wall Street. They didn't clear the park, but you know, that night I'm talking to some of these old activists, baby boomer communists, and I'm telling them how the construction workers were defending me. And they started crying, and tears came down their faces because they could remember the hard hat riots. They could remember the hard hat riots. They remembered when construction workers used to beat up anti-war protesters and beat up leftists. However, that was not the feeling. And in fact, that day at the rally at Occupy Wall Street, when all the people were there to defend Occupy Wall Street, there were a number of construction workers in their hard hats. And there was a guy who was a friend of mine who did video, and he went around and he interviewed construction workers who were there to support Occupy Wall Street. And construction worker after construction worker with their hard hat on told them that they supported Occupy Wall Street, that the big corporations are ripping people off, that they're breaking their unions, not paying union wages, and that they supported the kids at Occupy Wall Street. And what does that show? That shows that when circumstances change, consciousness also changes, right? And if you go, the construction workers unions in New York City, now there's still problems, no doubt, but they're not hostile to Occupy Wall Street, I'll tell you that much. They're not supporting the wars. They don't have rallies to support the wars anymore, I'll tell you that much. You know, there's not going to be a hard hat riot anytime soon among New York City construction workers. Now, a lot of them might have voted for Trump for this reason or other, but there won't be and conditions change. Circumstances change. And that's what a lot of folks don't seem to get, is that, you know, that situations are constantly changing. That's what I'm always talking about on here. A does not equal A. A does not equal A. And tomorrow is not the same as today and yesterday. And the world is constantly in a state of change. And when the situation changes, the tactics must also change. If the circumstances or the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. And this is Marxism. This is basic Marxism. And this is what I'm thank you very much for the super chat, PLN. This is what I'm espousing in We Are City Builders, right? That's the whole point. That's the whole point. In We Are City Builders, I'm trying to get people to understand this, and that if we are going to bring socialism to the United States, things have got to change. Look, some of these third worldists, right? They're always talking about aristocracy of labor, and you listen to them talk, and some of the things they say really make me do a double take. I listen to some of them talk. For example, one of the talking points that one of these third worldists used is his proof. His proof, he says, that there will never be a revolution in the United States, that U.S. workers benefit from imperialism, blah, blah, blah. Is he says, if you were to go to average workers in the United States and give them a gun and say, go kill the bourgeoisie, they wouldn't do it. Well, that's true for any country that is in a non-revolutionary situation. Most people don't want to kill. Most people don't want violence. Most people don't want to murder. So this idea, and does he think it's different in the developing world? Does he think that in the developing world, oh, you could just average people off the street, you could just say, "Here's a gun, go kill the bourgeoisie"? No, right? That's just not reality, right? That's not the reality, right? And that again, that's just such a very naive way of thinking about these things. Most human beings overwhelmingly don't want violence, and in a non-revolutionary situation, most people don't even really want to overthrow capitalism, right? If you had gone to the average Russian in 1901 and given them a gun and said, go kill the bourgeoisie, they wouldn't have taken it. You'd have gone to the average Russian in 1904 and given them a gun and said, go kill the bourgeoisie, they wouldn't have taken it. And in fact, the 1905 revolution in Russia only happened because of a horrendous massacre, because the ability of the people to peacefully march for bread had been taken away, right? This rally called by Father Gapon, who was this priest, this peaceful march for bread, had been violently attacked by the Tsar's police. They had gunned down peaceful marchers begging for bread, and there were strikes all across the country in response to it, and soldiers, there was an uprising within the military. But even then, it wasn't just average people being handed guns and being told to kill the bourgeoisie. So when this person goes around and says, oh, well, you know, it's clear because look, if you give an average person in the United States a gun, they don't want to kill the bourgeoisie. People don't want violence. People don't want to kill in any country in a non-communist situation. Another argument I heard from one of these third worldists is they said, oh, why is there so much anti-communism in the United States? It's because it's in the economic interests of the people here. Do you think there is not vicious anti-communism in the developing world? Do you think there is not vicious anti-communism in Chile? Look at the Pinochet regime. My wife is from Guatemala. Do you think there wasn't vicious anti-communism in Guatemala in the 70s and 80s, even up into today? There's a lot of people in Guatemala who admire Rios Montt, the military dictator who committed genocide against the indigenous people. You think there's not vicious anti-communism all across the world? Go to South Korea. In South Korea, it is against the law to advocate communism. Why is there no official communist party in South Korea? Because if it is, you go to prison under their national security laws. Any country that's not in a revolutionary situation is not going to have average people saying, give me a gun to kill the bourgeoisie. And in most countries in the world, there is a large amount of vicious anti-communism, right? So that argument is completely ridiculous. What they do have in the developing world that we don't have is that they tend to have mass communist organizations, right? There tend to be, in places like India, in places like Vietnam, in places like South Africa, you have mass communist organizations among the broad masses of people that are centers of the community, that feed people, that take care of people, that organize and mobilize for the community and the community's interests. That's what you have. We don't have that here. Top 3 book suggestions. We don't have that here. We don't have such things here. And as a result of that, there is a lack of communist consciousness among the population, and there is also a feeling among people who are attracted to communism that is not what they need to do, that they can just sit on the internet and feel like they're right, and be content to be right, and that they can formulate their politics in a very hostile and unattractive way. So I think people really need to rethink all this stuff, right? I think there are millions of Americans who are angry right now. There are millions of Americans who are ready to hear a genuine socialist message, but we've got to give it to them. We got to get out of the movement, and we got to get to the masses. Out of the movement to the masses. Out of the movement to the masses. Dare to struggle, dare to win. That's what we got to do. So glad to have you here, folks. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. We got plenty of super chats to answer. But now we'll do the roll call. Names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who's with us? Ash in Chicago. Ryan in Oakland. Cambridge, United Kingdom. Sam in Chicago. Tokyo. Carolyn on Staten Island. Nassau County. Char Darling. Good friend of the program. Great person who does a lot of great activism. Char Darling. Trans Marxist. Emma from Ontario. You've been doing great tweets, Trans Marxist. JT24 from Mississippi, Cleveland Pirate Alex, Allen in Chicago. A lot of folks from Chicago. They should connect with the local Chicago CPI. Cade in Scranton. Baron in Seattle. Kinky's with us. Sage in Utah. Chloe in Utah. Tristan in Maryland. Shout out to you, Tristan. Oh, you're doing great. Io. Shout out to you, Io, in New York City. That's great. That's great. Southwest Florida. Enoch, Australia. Bobby in Austin. Itzel in Las Vegas. Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati, great folk, great person. David in China, Lucas Mora in New York, Springfield, Missouri, Kabul International Airport. Is that a joke? Pennsylvania, Los Angeles County, Scotland, Dorset, England, Brad in St. Louis, from Alameda, California, Vinicius from Brazil, Mo in Toronto, Canada, Frederick from Maryland, Zephyr from Eugene, Oregon, Jay Perth from West Australia, Kieran from San Diego, David Fox from Bendigo, Australia, good friend of the show. You were streaming earlier, they were streaming early. David Fox and a guitar player and Dust James were earlier streaming about the foundations of Leninism, the book by Stalin. They were streaming that out. Check that out. Arturo out in Anchorage, Alaska, Nicholas in Mobile, Alabama, right? Kansas City, Missouri, Lucio in Brazil, Calgary, Canada, Caracas, Venezuela, Jose Gonzalez, Houston, Kinky out in Joshua Tree. Shout out to you, Kinky, good friend of the show. Jeff in Studio City, Nate from Sydney, Australia, Kalamazoo, Michigan. I have been to Kalamazoo. When I was a kid, I remember my dad had some kind of business meeting, so my brother and my mother and myself, we all got in the car and we drove from Ohio to Kalamazoo, Michigan. And if I remember correctly, there's an episode. The name Kalamazoo, right? It sounds like kangaroo, or it's just a wild name. When you're a kid, wild names like Kalamazoo, they stick with you. And then I think there was the show Arthur, the kids show Arthur, where they have some like fake cartoon, and it's like the little boy who goes to Kalamazoo, and it was just kind of silly. But anyway, we got Joey Keaton and Kiki, the John Brown volunteers in the NYC location, in the undisclosed location. Shout out to you guys. They are the best. They've been working hard. They represented us well at the Occupy Wall Street events and on the streets every day. Shout out to the John Brown volunteers. They are doing cutting edge work. If you haven't given them a donation, you ought to consider it. Shoot them a Venmo at John Brown Volunteers, Cash App. They're great folks. They're doing great work. They're out there every day struggling. And if you want to become a John Brown volunteer, I would like you to become one. We need to expand the John Brown Volunteer Corps. It's a group of dedicated, full-time organizers, young folks from around the country. They're doing great work. Go watch the video. I love the John Brown Volunteers. Shout out to them. Micah in Las Vegas. Mohsen from Iran. Sharon Pitts is in Alabama. Shout out to you, Sharon. I'm going to make you a moderator. You're just now a moderator. Ray's from Adelaide, Australia. Anthony in Detroit. Thanks to all the moderators. Og the Destroyer. Og, watch Caleb live stream. Og no like Caleb. Caleb like Russia and China. Og no like. Yeah, Og the Destroyer, folks. Wisconsin, St. David's, Bermuda, Fort Lauderdale, Los Angeles, Deb in Napa Valley, Nate in Chicago, Tushar in Connecticut. Tushar is doing great work. If you're in the Connecticut area, Kashar might be doing some organizing out there. Wow. Edward J. Stop. Very good. Edward J. Stop. What is Edward J. Stop? What does that mean? Oh, is someone telling Edward J. to stop something? Okay, I don't even know what's going on. I can't keep up with it. Thank goodness for all the mods. Thank goodness for all the mods. If it wasn't for all the mods doing what they do, I wouldn't be able to. My goodness, we've been raided. How many times have we been raided? Where it's like a bunch of libertarians or a bunch of 4chaners all pile in to try and make our lives miserable, but we just keep going. We just keep going. And I think, what's his name? That one libertarian fellow. What's his name? I don't even remember his name. He's the libertarian cultist guy who lives in Norway or whatever. He keeps claiming he shut down one of our streams when we talked for a half hour with all of his fans clanking in there. So whatever. Lucha in Mississippi, Frank in Rhode Island, Precarian, Kinky is giving a shout out to the John Brown Volunteers. Such a good thing to do. John Brown Volunteers are great. If you want to become a John Brown Volunteer, Now is the time to do it. I need to unban some people, by the way. Jenny Lynn sent me some instructions. I need to figure out how to unban some people because there's been some people that have been accidentally banned. We need to bring back mass casualty. I know he needs to be brought back. Hello, y'all, and Caleb, Mr. Red. Shout out to you, Mr. Red. You're a good guy. Calcutta, India. Sticks in Virginia. All right, folks. All right, folks. All right. So now, now we're going to go over the super chats. So if you have yet another, if you have another super chat question, by all means send it in, and we are just gonna go down the line. All right, the first question is left and right opportunism. What is the difference? Left and right opportunism. Okay, so the definition of opportunism, the standard definition of opportunism in the Marxist movement is one who puts their own self-interest ahead of the interests of the overall Marxist movement. That is the definition of opportunism. If one is putting their own personal advancement ahead of what will advance the struggle for socialism, that is called opportunism. And the difference between left and right opportunism is essentially why one does it. Or how one acts it out. Left opportunism is when people grandstand. I am so radical, right? It's left opportunism is generally done to make one look more radical. Right opportunism is generally done to try and tone things down and look less radical, right? Left opportunism would be boycotting elections and not participating in elections. Lenin writes an entire book called Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, arguing that why would you not participate in the elections and use the elections to spread communism? Well, if you're more interested in looking like you're super revolutionary, so you can boycott the elections, that would be left opportunism. However, right opportunism would be voting for Joe Biden, right? Because, hey, we just got to tone it down, right? And it's opportunism, the definition of it is generally putting one's own self-interest ahead of the interests of the revolutionary movement. You see an opportunity for oneself, and you seize that opportunity. You seize that opportunity rather than doing what is in the interest of the movement overall. And honestly, I would argue that a lot of the leaders of the Marxist movement as it currently exists are opportunist. Because for one, I am doing far more for the revolutionary movement by having these live streams, by writing the books that I book, by building the Center for Political Innovation, than I would do if I were in one of these Marxist parties. When I was in a Marxist party, do you think they would ever let me do streams like this? No. Do you think they would ever let me, give the presentations and write the books that I write? No. But if I wanted to have position, right? If I wanted to be able to be a big shot and be like, I am a leader of this party, I could not do that. But I'm actually making a bigger contribution by not doing that, but instead focusing on the Center for Political Innovation as a unique project doing what is not being done. And that is the role that I can play. So if I were to be in a party that would prevent me from making the contribution I'm capable of making, that would be a form of opportunism, right? And one of the struggles, if you're a communist, if you're a Marxist, if you're a revolutionary, you're someone who wants to bring down capitalism, one of the things you struggle with your whole life is what kind of contribution can I make? How can I make a contribution to the revolutionary movement? And what kind of contribution is it? And how can I get myself into a position in life where I'm able to maximize my contribution? Because there's nothing more frustrating than somebody who really, really, truly believes in communism and feels they could make a bigger contribution to the struggle, feels they could go out and sacrifice, but because of life circumstances, they're unable to do it. And it's a painful feeling to be in such a situation. And so for those of us who truly, genuinely believe in this, we struggle to get ourselves into a situation in life where we can maximize our contribution. And that's a journey that you have to go on. And there are different types of contributions. There are very different types of contributions. Some people are able to contribute by doing outreach, whether it's online outreach or on the street. Some people are able to make financial contributions. Some people are able to contribute by doing tasks that don't necessarily get recognized. Some people are able to make contributions by maintaining relationships and building organizations, and that we should really keep in mind, that the contributions people make come in many different forms, and you know, William Z. Foster used to talk about being a Jimmy Higgins, right? And how it's important to try and be a Jimmy Higgins, right? One who just will make sacrifices. I believe it was the leader, it was Harry Bridges, right? Public transit. Harry Bridges was the leader of the dock workers union in San Francisco. Harry Bridges, he said that if it's midnight and there are two guys running the mimeograph machine. And what is a mimeograph machine, right? That's before there were photocopies. There were this machine that, had ink on one side, and you put paper in it, and you cranked it to make leaflets, right? And it would stamp every leaflet. It would put more ink and then stamp every leaflet. A mimeograph machine. If it's midnight and you're cranking that, and there's two men cranking the mimeograph machine, one of those men is a communist. Harry Bridges. That's what he said. If it's midnight and there's two men cranking the mimeograph machine, one of those men is a communist. And he's referring to his labor union, right? That the communists were the most dedicated labor union organizers. And that, because they want to make their contribution to the revolutionary movement. And that we should all be thinking about how we can maximize our contribution. But at the same time, we should be recognizing that contributions come in different ways, and that a lot of times people feel defensive, they feel embarrassed, they feel like I'm not making enough of a contribution because I'm not making my contribution in a flashy way. It doesn't count, and that's not true. That is absolutely not true. And one position you never want to get into, is when you start going around going, I'm a better communist than you. That is the height of opportunism, if there ever was such a thing. When people get in the position of, well, I'm a real organizer, I guess you don't ever want to be that. You don't ever want to be that. You never want to be that person. I'm a real organizer. What are you? Never do you want to be that person. Never, 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 never. Right? That is a toxic tone. I wish those words could be removed from the lips of every communist I've ever met. I'm a real organizer. What do you, that is a nasty, or my favorite, this group doesn't do anything. Now, that's not a real criticism. Every communist group does stuff. They do stuff. The question is, what do they do? But, they start this, your group, well, you don't actually do anything. That's BS. All the communist groups do stuff. It's a question of what do they do? And is what they do beneficial or not? She refused to call Biden. That's the question. That's the question. Is what they're doing what needs to be done? But, this whole I actually do something, that is a very, I want to remove those words as well. We all struggle to make our contribution. The Internationale, the Communist Internationale, right? The American version. There's many different versions of the lyrics, right? In the United States, arise, ye prisoners of starvation, arise, ye wretched of the earth, right? In Britain, it's arise, ye workers from your slumber, arise, ye prisoners of want. There's different versions of it, but the American version of the Internationale, it has 2 verses, right? The British one has like 17 or something, but the American version is 2 verses. Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, arise, ye wretched of the earth, for reason in revolt now thunders, thank you, Gleb, a better world's in birth. No more tradition's chains shall bind us. Arise, ye slaves, no more in thrall. The earth shall rise on new foundations. We have been naught, we shall be all. 'Tis the final conflict, let all stand in their place. The Internationale shall be the human race. But then the next verse, the second verse of the American version of the Internationale, is particularly good. And a lot of people don't know the second verse. I think the reason that people don't know the second verse is because of the word booty, right? Booty refers to stolen goods. That's what it means. Now, unfortunately, because of slang, now it refers to, butts. But, in standard English, prior to current American slang, the term booty referred to stolen goods. We know about the pirate when he would steal from other people. He would get their booty. Arrgh, give me booty. Right? If you steal stolen goods, they're called booty. So, and I think that's why people don't know this verse, because you can't say booty anymore because people think it means, I don't know. But anyway, the second verse to the American version of the Internationale is very good, very important. I think it's really important. The second verse to the American version of the Internationale goes like this. We want no condescending saviors to rule us from the judgment hall. We workers ask not for their favors, let us consult for all. To make the thieves give up their booty, to free the spirit from the cell. Each must themselves decide their duty, they must decide and do it well. So what is that saying, right? So to make the thieves give up their booty, obviously is seize the means of production, right? It's the capitalists exploiting the workers, that, to make the thieves, the capitalists give up their booty. To free the spirit from the cell, what does that mean? It means to unleash human potential, to free the spirit from the cell. The idea is that capitalism is restraining human beings. It is preventing them from living up to their true potential, right? That human beings are capable of doing so much more than what the world is under capitalism. Capitalism is holding back human potential. It's reducing us to greedy, profit-hungry, selfish creatures that are cruel to each other, that are indifferent toward each other's suffering. It's holding back, technological innovation, and that to make the thieves give up their booty, to seize the means of production, to free the spirit from the cell, right? To free the spirit from the cell, each must themselves decide their duty. You must decide and do it well, meaning that you ultimately are faced with a choice. You, yes, you, an individual with free will, you must decide your duty. You must figure out what your obligation to the revolution is. You must figure out what you can do to make socialism and make capitalism be overturned. You must figure out what you can do. Thank you very much for the super chat. You must figure out what you can do. Each must themselves decide their duty. They must decide and do it well. I like that second verse, the Internationale. I unfortunately, the line about booty, I don't know. We'll have to change that, to make the thieves give up their what? We'll have to think of another, another word so we don't get in trouble for saying booty and people don't, immediately think of, whatever. Think it's, but it's a good verse. I like that second verse. What's interesting, I'll just say this before I end my opening remarks. The British version of the Internationale, it has a verse that is particularly badass, right? Which is not in the American one, but it's in the British one. And it's particularly badass. And I think it applies to revolutionary situations, right? The British version of the Internationale, they have a verse, and the verse, it's one of the last verses to the British version of the Internationale. No more delayed by their reaction. On tyrants only will make war. The soldiers too will take strike action, break their ranks and fight no more. And if those cannibals keep trying to sacrifice us for their pride, then soon they'll hear the bullets flying. We'll shoot the generals on our own side. That's good stuff, huh? All right, Salac, Mexico. It's about insubordination in the ranks and soldiers turning their guns around. I think that's particularly badass. It's a particularly badass version of the Internationale. No more delayed by their reaction. On tyrants only will make war. The soldiers too will take strike action, break their ranks, and fight no more. And if those cannibals keep trying to sacrifice us to their pride, then soon they'll hear the bullets flying. We'll shoot the generals on our own side. A little violent, but hey, it's the British. We don't say that in ours, so don't hold me accountable. Take that up with Joe T. Brar and Harpel Brar. They're responsible. I'm just kidding. They're not. No. They didn't write that. It was written before they were born. I'm sure. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I love you, my British comrades. I'm not trying to blame you for the verses of your Internationale. But there's plenty of British folks in here. Even though it's got to be some kind of ungodly hour here. What can we learn from Stalin? All right. It's got to be some kind of ungodly hour, in the UK. But there's Scottish folks on here. There we go. All right, folks. All right. Oh wow, I'm not in my opening. Part of me thought I was still in my opening remarks, didn't I? Wow, and we're already in super chats. So there you go. I just did a blank there. Wow, it's been a long day, right? Wake me up when September ends, as they say. All right, Nicaraguan elections. Look, the people of Nicaragua, they've been through a lot of hardship. They had a socialist revolution in 1979. They rose up. They overthrew a U.S.-backed dictator named Somoza, and then the USA imposed over a decade of civil war on the country. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed by Contra terrorists. And then they had an election in 1992, and the Sandinistas lost. They lost the election. And so for a little while, they had a free market neoliberal regime that tried to undo the revolution. But then in 2006, Daniel Ortega was reelected as the president, and they've been moving towards socialism ever since then. And of course, the USA can't stand this. Oh, it must be a brutal dictatorship. Well, that's funny. It wasn't a brutal dictatorship in the 1992 when you guys won the election, right? I mean, that must be a brutal dictatorship, right? It's an authoritarian regime, crushing freedom, blah, blah, blah. The USA incited and paid drug gangs in 2018 to run through the streets and terrorize people and murder people. It's been proven that American NGOs were working with narco gangs to terrorize the country and create unrest in the country. And now they're going to have another election coming up in Nicaragua. I intend to be there in Nicaragua for that election, if at all possible. I intend to go there because it looks like the United States, the U.S. imperialists, are up to their same old tricks. They're going to say it's a dictatorship and all of that. And my good friend Ramiro has been to Nicaragua, and he has shown the beautiful things going on there with socialism. And I intend to go to Nicaragua for the elections and be on the ground and show what's really happening there, because the Sandinistas, what they have accomplished in Nicaragua, it's quite interesting. Economically, Nicaragua has had astounding results. Compared, Honduras, that's a free market, Western capitalist regime. People are starving and miserable. Guatemala, free market capitalist regime, starving and miserable. But Dostoyevsky, right? Anti-communists. It's a free market regime, but Nicaragua, they've had real victories. And in terms of life expectancy, in terms of literacy, they've wiped out illiteracy. They have enabled people to start small businesses. They have eradicated poverty. They've wiped out extreme poverty in the country. They've empowered indigenous groups. I mean, what Nicaragua has achieved, and of course, in the United States, they just say brutal dictatorship because that's what they always say, right? They want impoverished captive market client states. So there you go. F Joe Biden chants. Well, look, that's not the most winning chant, right? Regardless of what we think of Joe Biden, if you just chant F this person, right? It's not a very winning chant. I remember I was at the Democratic National Convention in 2012. There were protests going on outside the Democratic National Convention, Occupy Wall Street folks. And, a lot of these Occupy Wall Street folks didn't like Barack Obama for obvious reasons, but one of the chants they would do is they would chant 1, F Obama, 2, F Obama, 3, Obama is an effing traitor. And the thing was, that chant, there were a lot of people who heard that chant and they thought we were in the Tea Party. They didn't think we were left-wing radicals. They thought we were in the Tea Party. And honestly, I mean, I didn't chant that. When they chanted that, I didn't chant that with them. And the political group I was in, we decided we were not going to chant that. That was not a helpful chant. And sometimes I felt like we were a little soft on Obama, but that was not a productive chant. And we were in North Carolina, we were in the South. We're in the South, for goodness sakes. And I mean, a crowd of people in the South chanting, it was a white crowd, mostly white crowd, chanting that. I mean, that chant, I mean, it was, again, people thought we were racist. People thought we were coming from the right. I mean, it's not, if you just say F somebody, it doesn't communicate things very effectively, and I'm sure there's Trump people that are chanting F Biden. I'm sure there's anti-war and more radical people that are chanting F Biden. I think you need a better way of communicating your message. If you just chant F the person, all that does is communicate dislike for the individual. But there are many reasons one can dislike Biden, right? You could dislike Biden because we're not keeping the troops in Afghanistan to finish the job. You could dislike Biden because he's a communist working for the Chinese, or you could dislike Biden because he's not fulfilled his promises, because he stole, the Democratic primary from Bernie Sanders, etc. You could not like Biden for various reasons, but that's not one of the reasons I do not endorse the F Biden chant. I think people can do better than that. I think people that don't like Biden can find a better way of communicating their message. I'll just be honest. I'm all for criticizing Biden, not pro-Biden. I'm all for criticizing Trump, not pro-Trump, but we can do better than that. Is there an uptick of socialism and communism due to my lives? Well, more people are ready to hear this message than ever before. I have never seen so much interest in socialism and communism in my life, okay? I mean, the polls, and look, BreadTube is filling a void. People want to hear about this stuff. That's why they came up with BreadTube. They invented BreadTube because they knew people are looking for socialism and communism, and they wanted to give them a safe version of it. I mean, look, I mean, the polls have come out. People are interested in socialism and communism. I mean, I would argue that people have always been kind of interested, but there's always been more interest than you would think. Right? A lot of communist groups decided, oh, no one wants to hear it, and they're wrong in that. People are interested in hearing it, but I think people are open to hearing it more than they ever have been before. When people are economically suffering, when China is rising and having economic successes, people are ready for socialism. People are interested in learning about socialism, learning the various interpretations and such, and that's why educational work is so important. That's why we came out with this this book, right? And that's why people are having study groups of this book around the country, in Texas and in Chicago and in New York and in different parts of the country. People are studying this book because it's teaching you the basics of socialism and Marxism, right? And we've got all kinds of material in here. That's why we're doing it. That's why there's an audience for this kind of stuff. So yeah, I think people are interested. So there you go. France's reaction after the Australia-UK-US deal, right? So Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom are aligned now in the South China Sea. France feels dissed because they have islands in that area and they were not invited to be part of it. They feel dissed, not surprisingly. But as I have said before, there is an increasing amount of distance between the European mainland and the United States and Britain. Australia is a former, it's part of the, what do they call it? The Commonwealth. It's part of the Commonwealth, but it's very much, former British colony, part of the Commonwealth, and the United States and Britain. This is the Atlanticists, right? This is the Atlanticists, the top dogs of Western imperialism. France is an imperialist country, Germany, Italy, etc. But the European mainland has often felt like it's not part of the club. It's not part of the club, and that those underlying tensions led to the First World War, and then they reasserted themselves with the Second World War, and that the European mainland has often been disrespected by the Atlanticist powers, the United States and Britain, or the Anglosphere, as Totoki in the chat calls them. But yeah, the Atlanticists, the Anglosphere, have long disrespected the European mainland. That's long-standing, and probably one of the main disagreements, as I've mentioned before, is nuclear power, right? France is all about nuclear power, and the oil monopolies of the United States and Britain are not. So there you go, right? Why is the U.S. intervening in Syria? For a couple reasons. The first reason the USA is intervening in Syria is because the Syrian Arab Republic is an anti-imperialist socialist government, right? The Ba'athist Arab socialist government came to power it came to power and it aligned with the Soviet Union. It industrialized, it built power plants, it raised its people out of poverty, and it has provided arms and weapons to the Palestinians, and it has considered itself to be an anti-imperialist socialist country that is not, the playground of Wall Street. Now, there are more specific reasons. One reason is that the Syrian government was presented with two choices. Would it build an oil pipeline for Saudi Arabia and Qatar, or would it build an oil pipeline for Iran? Right? And the Syrian government chose to build an oil pipeline for Iran. At the time that the Syrian civil war got started, Syria was in the process of building an oil pipeline that would give the Islamic Republic of Iran the ability to export oil in the Mediterranean. Right? Iran does not, have access to the Mediterranean. It has access to the the ocean. They call it the Persian Gulf or whatever, but they don't have access to the Mediterranean. Well, this would have given Iran the ability to pump its oil through Syria to the Mediterranean, and they didn't want that. And instead of, Syria agreed to start building this oil pipeline for Iran to help Iran export oil to the Mediterranean, and it didn't agree to help the Saudis pump oil up into Europe, right? The Saudis wanted to build an oil pipeline from Saudi Arabia up through Syria, to pump oil into Europe. And they didn't agree to do the Saudi pipeline. They didn't agree to the Qatari pipeline. They did agree to the Iranian pipeline. That's a factor. What other factors are there? One of the other factors is the Oded Yanan plan, right? The Israeli military in the 1980s was revealed to have had a strategy for fomenting sectarian religious divisions in that region, right? Keeping the Sunnis and the Shias, right? CPRF is revisionist. Keeping the Sunnis and the Shias killing each other, keeping the Christians at odds with the Muslims, etc. Right? That has been the plan of Israel for a long time, is to foment religious sectarianism in that region. Well, the Syrian Arab Republic is one of the few governments in that region where you have Sunnis, which are the majority. That's like 80% in Syria, Sunnis. They're very well represented. But you also have Alawites, which are a form of Shia Muslim. That's what Assad is. He's an Alawite, and they're very well represented in the government. And you have Christians, and Christians are very well represented. There's a lot of Syrian Christians, and they're well represented in the government. And there are other religious groups in Syria that are well represented in the government. The Syrian Arab Republic is a secular government that unifies various religious groups. And the whole plan of Israel since the 1980s has been to foment religious division. And so if you look at the forces that are being used to bring down the Syrian government, they are Sunni Wahhabi fanatics. They want to set up a Wahhabi, Salafi, Sunni government that would forcibly, force out all the Alawites, force out all the Christians, and force sectarian religious division. Right? And Iran is a Shia Muslim government, and if the anti-Assad forces win, it will become a Sunni Wahhabi government in Syria, and that would lead to fights between Sunnis and Shias. And so, in order to foment religious sectarian division, the Syrian government must fall. There are a number of reasons the USA wants to bring down the Syrian government. It's unifying religious groups. It's arming the Palestinians. It was working with Iran to grant oil access to Iran. It's a socialist country with a centrally planned economy that is raising its people up out of poverty. It's an ally of Russia. It has been an ally of Russia since the days of the Soviet Union. It was working with China. China was working with Syria to develop their natural gas infrastructure. It's an ally of China. It's an ally of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's everything the imperialists can't stand. That's why they want to bring down the Syrian Arab Republic. And they've been working on trying to bring it down since the 80s at least. I mean, there was an armed uprising in the 80s by the Muslim Brotherhood that was funded by the United States, and Homs and Hama. There have been various attempts by the United States to destabilize Syria. Now, Syria, there have been times where Syria has offered to align with the imperialists. They supported the war on terror when it began. They supported the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein because they were anti-Iraq. They had a falling out with Iraq. So it's complicated. The Syrian government is complicated, and they've made mistakes. But I'll tell you one thing. In Syria, you have two communist parties that are represented in the government. the Syrian Communist Party and the Syrian Communist Party Bakdash. In factories in Syria, you have labor unions, communist-led labor unions in Syria. In Syria, you have religious diversity. In Syria, all the problems that they have, and they do have problems. In Syria, you have a lot of, Syrian television and the funding of the arts. They've got, a lot of art and a lot of, public. Syrian television is very high quality for the Arab world. It has some of the most hard-hitting, socially conscious, material. Bringing down the Syrian Arab Republic would be a bad thing, and it's not going to happen. At this point, the stronghold of the anti-Assad uprising has been retaken by the Syrian government. The Syrian government's they've already won this war. Okay, they've already won, and the USA just keeps prolonging this. Right? They are trying their hardest to just keep killing people, keep creating refugees, keep creating instability. They should just stop. The Syrian Arab Republic is going to stay intact. Bashar Assad is going to remain the president of Syria. The Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party and its allies in the Syrian Social Nationalist Party and in the Syrian Communist Party and the Syrian Communist Party Bakdash, they're going to remain in power. And that's what's going to happen. And the United States is just so determined to keep the bodies piling in. And it's really disgusting, right? They have taken a war that would have been over in a week, and they've prolonged it for almost a decade. It's unbelievable. All right. So there you go. That's my answer about why the USA is intervening in Syria. Imperialism benefits U.S. workers. Somewhat. We do have a higher standard of living here at the center of the empire than we do around the world. And we shouldn't deny that. But at the same time, it is in the ultimate interest of U.S. workers to bring down imperialism. The U.S. working class would be far better off without imperialism, with a socialist society in the United States. But is there a slight benefit? Do we have a higher standard of living? Sure. However, let me add, the standard of living in the United States is dropping, is going down. And the labor aristocracy is being demolished. We don't benefit like we once did by any means. And if we were to build a socialist society that was trading with the rest of the world on the basis of win-win cooperation, building infrastructure, raising people out of poverty, that would be far better, far, far better for the people of the United States. So in the long term, yes, but in the short term, is there some benefit? Sure, and we shouldn't deny that. And labor aristocracy is a real thing, but it's being demolished. They're getting rid of the labor aristocracy right now. So these people that bring that up, they're kind of missing the point. Israel and China, of course, Israel and China have a relationship. The Soviet Union was very much responsible for the creation of Israel. The Soviet Union recognized Israel. The Soviet Union voted to create Israel at the United Nations. China, at this point, does do business with Israel and supports Israel. Nobody denies that. That relationship is certainly there, and that's a fact. I don't deny that, and I'm not pro-Israel, but Israel and China have a relationship. Russia and Israel have a relationship. So that is the situation. All right. Are you optimistic about the resurgence of a genuine left? Yeah, it's already happening, and they're trying so hard to kill it because it's happening. Right? Medicare for all, force the vote, Jackson Hinkle. It's happening, and they're trying so hard to make sure it doesn't happen. They're working overtime with BreadTube and Young Turks and they're like trying their hardest to prevent it from occurring, but it's happening. It's happening. It's happening. It's happening, and they wouldn't be going overtime. Look, they wouldn't have to have people all over the internet saying nasty lies about me. They wouldn't have to do that if people weren't ready to hear what I had to say. If there was no danger of anyone ever agreeing with me, do you think it would be necessary for all these nasty personal attacks to be out there about me? Do you think they would have to run Jimmy Dore's name through the mud if there wasn't a danger of a lot of people listening to him? Look, they are very threatened by this, right? We are having a huge impact. We are having a very big impact, and more people are ready to hear us. No doubt about it. Books on the history of China. Books on the history of China. Well, one of the best books I've ever read on the history of China is called China Shakes the World. It's by Martin Jakes. Martin Jakes, China Shakes the World. That's a great book. I learned so much from that book. It goes from the history of the dynasties all the way up into now. Lots of economic data in that book, full of statistics and data and information. You will know China very well if you read Martin Jake's When China Shakes the World. I don't know, When China Rules the World by Martin Jakes. When China Rules the World by Martin Jakes. Another book I would recommend on the history of China would be Red Star Over China by Edgar Snow. Red Star Over China by Edgar Snow, which is the book written by Edgar Snow. Edgar Snow was the first journalist to ever interview Mao Zedong, and he wrote an entire book about his journey to China, his experiences in China, how he came to interview Mao, what Mao was like. Mao told him his whole life story. It was published in 1937, and it is a very insightful book about who Mao Zedong was, where the Chinese Revolution came from. I would recommend Red Star Over China. It's a very, very, very good book. It was Mao's introduction to the world. Mao was known in China, but it introduced Mao Zedong to the world. The American journalist Edgar Snow interviewed Mao and introduced him to the world. It's a very important book. Very important book. A third book, another book on the history of China that I would recommend. What other books do I recommend? There's a book called China's Socialist Economy, and it was published by the Chinese Communist Party in 1980, and there's no author. It's like an official Chinese Communist Party book. It's very big, it's very long, but it is an official economic history of China's socialist economy from the time of 1949's revolution all the way up to the Deng Xiaoping market reforms. And that's very good as well. I learned a huge amount from that book. What other books on the history of China would I recommend? There's a lot that was published during the Cultural Revolution that I'm not sure I would endorse the contents of, because of the fact that the Cultural Revolution was pretty awful and there was a lot of negative things that happened. But there's a book called Some of Us, SOME of Us, and it's essays by women, women who grew up in China during the Cultural Revolution, and it is their experiences as women. Teenagers basically growing up under Mao's rule, and they are critical of the anti-communist stuff that's out there. They argue that much of what is written about the Cultural Revolution is what they call scar literature that just talks about the negative. And they try in their essays, they all kind of describe what their experiences were like during the Cultural Revolution. They try in their essays to give a more balanced picture of what it was like. So I would recommend the book Some of Us. Some of Us. I recommend that book as well on the Cultural Revolution. It's women who lived through the Cultural Revolution. When I was in high school, one of my favorite books by far was a book called Daily Life in Revolutionary China. And it was published by an Italian parliament member, a woman, Maria, her last name is a very long Italian name, Maria Mascioschi, Maria something or other. She was a member of the Italian parliament who was a communist. She went to China in the 1970s, and she wrote this book called Daily Life in Revolutionary China. That book is a little bit naive, okay? It shows the Cultural Revolution in a very positive light. I wouldn't fully recommend that book now. Some parts of that book are a little bit, she glosses over the ugly side of the Cultural Revolution. She shows it in a very positive light. I wouldn't full on recommend or agree with the contents of that book. But if you want to understand how China presented itself in like 1970, Mascioschi, right? Maria Antonietta Mascioschi, yeah. If you want to understand what China was presenting itself to the world as in 1970, 1971, 1972, read that book. I remember that book. I read it when I was in high school, and I really liked it. One of the things I remember was that, there's a chapter called The Port of Dialectic, and it was about how, the dock workers in Shanghai, every day at lunchtime, they had a class on Hegel, and how these dock workers were being taught Hegelian philosophy. And that was part of Mao's belief, that philosophy should not be only for the intellectuals. And these dock workers, it's called the Port of Dialectic, and they're being taught Hegelian philosophy at the port. That's pretty amazing. Another thing I remember is that there was there was, there's a part in the book where the Red Guards, the revolutionary, Mao supporting teenagers, come to her and they say to her, "Is it true that in America, the boys grow their hair long like girls and they inject themselves with narcotics and they listen to rock and roll music?" And she said, "Yes." And they said, "Do they not realize they are being tools of the bourgeoisie?" I thought that was really funny. There was this whole section where the Red Guards, they find out that she's been to America, and the Red Guards hated hippies. They hated hippies. They hated rock music. They hated counterculture. And it's really funny. And she's sitting there and she's shocked. It's like they're supposed to be communists, right? But they're sitting there, and the Red Guards of China, they just are horrified by American counterculture. It's just clearly contrary to everything it means to be a communist. I thought that was amusing when I read it. I thought, wow, that's kind of opposite. Another thing she talks about in the book is she talks about she goes to a high school where they, during the Cultural Revolution, they had overthrown their teacher, and they'd gotten rid of their teacher for being a revisionist, and she interviews that. But again, the Cultural Revolution was pretty awful, and that book is very much, it shows only the positive side of the Cultural Revolution. Shout out to Nathan Rich, who's in the chat, by the way. A great YouTube channel. But it's good to check it out. Nathan Rich is recommending another great way to see China is to check out the magazines they released for Western consumption, such as China Pictorial. Yeah, and I believe there was they called it the Peking Review. The Peking Review was very widely studied. That was kind of China's, ideological voice to the West. You can read the Peking Review. It's all interesting stuff. And Italian communist writer Pasolini. I've never heard of Pasolini. I'm not familiar with him at all. But it's worth looking at the stuff. But yeah, When China Rules the World by Martin Jakes. Red Star Over China by Edgar Snow. I also really enjoyed this book called China, The Rise of a Civilization State. The Rise of a Civilization State. And it's written by a Chinese author, but it's available in English. And it talks about, China's transformation, the Rise of a Civilization State. That's a very good book. The China Wave, Rise of a Civilization State, I believe it's called. I read that. I learned a huge amount about China from that book. That one was pretty good. So yeah, there's many good things that have been published over the years. All right. Is the Quad going to become the Asian NATO? Well, the Quad is only 4 countries, right? It's Japan, Australia, the United States, It's Japan, Australia, the United States, and who else? And one other country in the Quad. I can't remember the Quad. And it's the Quadrilateral Dialogue. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, it's called. And, yes, it's moving in that direction, right? Now, you have to remember that Obama tried to create with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. He tried his hardest to create basically an either-or situation in Asia. Either do business with the United States or with China. Either or. And it didn't work. The trade deal that he set up, the TPP, it would have given so many economic concessions to these countries. It wasn't going to work out. And the TPP, it was largely defeated. I mean, most of the ruling class was against it, but Obama tried his hardest to basically create a trade zone, and it didn't work. And Trump ultimately canceled it. Hillary Clinton said she was against it. Who knows if she would have changed her mind or whatever. That was Obama's attempt to basically create, a very wide alliance, an economic zone that would have been a U.S. alliance for the TPP, in Asia. And what was hilarious was when Donald Trump denounced the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, he said China was going to be part of it. And that was he didn't realize the whole point of it was such dishonesty because the TPP was set up by Obama to be an anti-China trade zone deal. But it didn't go through, and I think that was a good thing. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was bad. The Quad is the Pacific Military Alliance. Yes, and why is the South China Sea so important? Okay, China depends on foreign oil. Okay, they need oil. And that's one of their weaknesses. And most of China's oil comes on oil tankers that go to ports in southern China, in places like Shanghai, other ports in southern China. So that, the ability of the United States to create a naval blockade in the South China Sea would shut down the Chinese economy. If the United States was able to prevent the inflow of oil into China, that would shut down China's economy. The United States has built up its military presence in the South China Sea to intimidate China, and to basically say at any point we can naval blockade you and stop the flow of oil via the South China Sea. And you have to remember, it is the South China Sea. So in response to the United States, we're on the other side of the world, building up our presence in the South China Sea. China has built up its presence. They want to be able to prevent the United States from interfering in the South China Sea. And they want to be able to prevent a naval blockade. Why are we mad about China in the South China Sea? How would we feel if China had a huge military apparatus in the Gulf of Mexico? I mean, the amount of hypocrisy is ridiculous. But yes, China, they need the South China Sea to be secure. They need to make sure those oil tankers, they keep coming, right? Oil tankers from Iran, oil tankers from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia. They need that oil to keep coming to the Chinese mainland. And if the United States, tries to cut them off, they have to be in a position where they can fight, right? And the United States, but it's intimidating China in the South China Sea. So there you go, and that's what's going on there. And again, they make it sound like it's about fishing boats. Well, no, the Philippines has the fishing rights now. They gave the fishing rights to the Philippines. They're not going to mess with the fishing boats, right? And it's the South China Sea situation. The way it's portrayed in the United States is ridiculous. Coming War on China by John Pilger is very good. I do recommend it. Very, very good stuff. What's the difference between Trotskyism and liberalism? A dirty war. Okay, a dirty war. Right? All right. What is the difference between Trotskyism and liberalism? Well, Trotskyism is a variant, an interpretation of Marxism. Right? It is the permanent revolution theory of Leon Trotsky. Trotsky argued, basically Trotsky's belief was that until communism spreads to the Western capitalist countries, it doesn't count, right? And that until you have communism in the Western countries, until you have communism in Britain, the United States, France, Germany, it doesn't really count, right? The proletariat can take power in developing countries, but they can't really build socialism in those countries because they're too poor. Only in the Western countries does communism count. That's Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. And so Trotsky came up with this theory of permanent revolution. He developed it. And the idea is that in the developing world at his time, there wasn't a big enough working class, so they couldn't have a revolution. So if they took power, they would have to spread it to the West. He came up with this theory, and it's actually Trotsky didn't invent it. The theory of permanent revolution was actually invented by Alexander Parvus. Alexander Parvus was a leader of the German Social Democratic Party. He was born in Russia, but he moved to Germany. He was leader of the Social Democratic Party. And he was a very important Marxist intellectual, but he was also an intelligence officer. He worked for the German secret police. And he became the financial advisor for the Turkish government, the Ottoman Empire. He was their financial advisor. And he was Trotsky's financial sugar daddy. He gave Trotsky lots of money, and he came up with the theory of permanent revolution. And Trotsky, he basically came up with the basics of it, and then Trotsky expounded on it and made it his own. He was an intelligence officer. And one of the aspects of the theory of permanent revolution was the idea that you should have what you called the United States of Europe, or the European Union, basically. But they didn't call it that. It was to call for the United States of Europe, right? Trotsky argues the only place that it matters if you have socialism is Western Europe. So in order to advance the revolution in Western Europe, we need to have Germany and France and Britain and all these countries become one country. They need to become the United States of Europe, and that'll break down the national barriers and bring the working class of Europe closer together so that we get closer to socialism. So Trotsky is going around, in the name of his theory of permanent revolution, he's going around trying to get Marxists in Europe to support the United States of Europe. And Lenin opposes this. And Lenin says that the reason that the United States of Europe would not be good is because that would strengthen imperialism, right? That by bringing all the Western capitalist powers together, that would combine their strength. and it would enable them to exploit the developing world. And the job of socialists and revolutionaries in the West is not to strengthen imperialism, but the opposite. It would be to play up the divisions, right? And to play up the divisions between the Germans and the French and the British and the Americans, right? And that Trotsky's going around trying to unite the imperialist countries, when in reality he should have been trying to divide the imperialist countries. And that was what was wrong with it. That Lenin discovered with his theory of imperialism that in the 20th century, the revolutionary energy would not be in Western Europe because of the rise of the aristocracy of labor, the stratification and division of the working class in the imperialist homelands. Because of that, the revolutionary energy was going to be in the third world. It was going to be in the impoverished countries, right? And it would be their fight for national liberation as nations, with the working class at the lead. That would be the basis of the revolution. Trotsky never accepted that. Trotsky never allowed himself to accept that the developing world was where the revolutionary energy was going to be. Trotsky held on to the belief, which Marx believed also, and Marx was wrong about, that the West was the best. The West is what counts, right? Trotsky held on to that, and his theory of permanent revolution was that belief. It's that only the Western countries are developed enough and advanced to have socialism, and if you have a revolution in Russia, if you have a revolution in China or Vietnam, these countries should just be a temporary holdout in a global revolution to spread communism to the West. Trotsky was wrong, right? And after the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Lenin died, and there was a debate about how to move forward. And there was the Bukharinite, they were the right opposition, and they said, basically, we're too poor to have socialism, so we got to make peace with the Western capitalist countries, sign treaties, and we got to have a prolonged free market system, basically because we're just too poor. And we got to we just got to basically have capitalism in Russia as long as we can because we're too poor. And we got to sign treaties with the West to do it, and whatever. Trotsky said the opposite. He said, we need to turn our country into a military fortress to spread communism all over the world. Stalin had the centrist position of socialism in one country. He said, we're going to rapidly industrialize with 5-year economic plans. We're going to have a socialist economy, but we are going to sign treaties with the West. We are going to normalize relations with Western countries, etc. So Stalin's position of socialism in one country is what ultimately won out. And Trotsky continued to push for his theory of permanent revolution. He wanted the Soviet Union to be spreading communism all over the world, and specifically spreading it to the West, because the West is the best, the West is all that matters. And that's Trotskyism. Trotskyism is a variant of Marxism. Liberalism is not Marxism. Liberalism is a belief in the individual above all else. It is a belief in, that the role of society is simply cultivating individualism, breaking down collectivism. The government is best that governs least. Economic liberalism is the idea that you should have free markets and the government shouldn't intervene in the economy. Social liberalism is breaking down the sense of community obligation, the idea that you have an obligation to your family, the idea that you have an obligation to your community, to your country, breaking that down. Everyone's on their own. Everyone can do whatever they want. Economic liberalism and social liberalism, that's the Western ideology. We believe in radical individualism, economic individualism, and social individualism, right? That's what we believe in. And all sense of collectivism is being broken down in the West. Trotskyism is different than that. Trotskyism is a Eurocentric, interpretation of Marxism that is based on Trotsky and the theory of permanent revolution. So that's the difference. Top 3 book suggestions. The first book I would recommend, by far, the most important book you can read, would be The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. That is the most important book on Marxism that I can recommend. There is no other book on Marxism that I have learned so much about, so much from reading. The History of the Three Internationals. If you've read The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster, you're doing great, because that's a really important book on the history of Marxism. He explains the entire history of Marxism from the time of Marx all the way up to World War II. You read that book, you will have a rich understanding of our movement, where we came from, where we're going, etc. History of the Three Internationals. I recommend that. What other 2 books would I recommend? What other two books would I recommend? Wow. I mean, of all the other books, which other two do I recommend? And I can't recommend my own books, right? Because we've got, the textbook We Are City Builders, which is designed to give you a basic introduction to what all this is all about. We got BreadTube Serves Imperialism, my critique of the new internet brand of pseudo-socialism, right? Sold like hotcakes on the internet because I got all of them. I trolled them all and got them all to advertise it. You got my book on Kamala Harris and the future of America. If she ever becomes president, I may regret having published this book, but whatever, life goes on. People needed to hear the contents of this book. But you asked me to recommend 3 books, and I can't recommend my own books, right? So what other books would I recommend? One book that comes to mind is The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That is a very, very good text that will help you, understand Marxism, and the development and how the Bolshevik movement developed and stuff. The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, short course, published in 1936. I recommend that. What other books would I recommend? That's 2. History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, History of the 3 Internationals. Towards Soviet America by William Z. Foster is a very good book that I would recommend. It was his manifesto that he wrote for the 1932 presidential elections. Very clear. The last chapter of Towards Soviet America is the United Soviet States of America, what the USSA would look like. I would also recommend The Twilight of World Capitalism by William Z. Foster. That's a very, very good book that I would recommend. I got a lot from reading it. What other books would I recommend? Working Class USA, The Power and the Movement by Gus Hall is a very, very good book. You'll learn Gus Hall and his revolutionary working class approach as leader of the Communist Party in the Cold War years. What other books would I recommend? Michael Parenti is a very good writer. His writings on imperialism, Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti is a very, very good book. Albert Szymanski is a Marxist writer. He wrote some books on imperialism that I would recommend. Labor and Monopoly Capital by Harvey Braverman. That is a very good book. It's an introduction to Marxist economics by Harvey Braverman, the Marxist economists. Wage, Labor, and Monopoly Capital. Harpal Brar, right, has written some very, very good books on imperialism. The Eve of Revolution of the Proletariat by Harpal Brar is a very good work. That is a very, very good book explaining imperialism and the economic system. I learned a lot, I will say, from the book Low Wage Capitalism by Fred Goldstein. I learned a lot from that book. I learned a lot from the book High Tech, Low Pay by Sam Marcy. I learned a lot from that book as well. That's a very... The Future is Up to Us by Nelson Peary. Very good book. That is... Future is Up to Us by Nelson Peary, a very good Marxist text explaining how the computer revolution applies to the concept of overproduction, etc. So that's plenty of books I just recommended there. So there you go. All right. Public transit in the USA versus Europe. Our public transit here is an embarrassment. Our public transit here is a joke. And that's what many people who come to the United States, they specifically come to New York City, they're horrified by our public transportation system. You go to Paris, you go to Britain, London, you go to Germany, you go to Belgium. Our train system here is an embarrassment. And most of the United States doesn't even have public transportation. New York City, we have probably the best in the country, and it sucks. And it's embarrassing. It's always delayed. It's fallen apart. I was in Moscow and I couldn't believe how amazing their train system is, and China, it's amazing what they're doing with their trains. Our public transportation in the United States is a full-on embarrassment if there ever was such a thing. I'll tell you that much. It's infuriating. But anything that's public in the United States is falling apart, right? Because we don't need public property. That's communism, right? Everything's best if it's privatized. And little secret, our subways in New York City are not actually public property. They are a state monopoly. They're a private company called the MTA. The Metropolitan Transit Authority, and they are actually a private company. They are a private company that is a public beneficent corporation. So they're making profits. Banks are making profits from it. They privatized the subways in New York City during the 1970s. So the subways in New York City are not public property, right? They are not public property. All right. Xi Jinping refuses to call Joe Biden. I can't comment on that. I haven't heard the details. The CELAC meeting going on in Mexico. Well, look, the United States created the Organization of American States, the OAS. They've never allowed Cuba to join. And the OAS is pretty bad. And CELAC is considered an alternative to the Organization of American States. Mexico is definitely a big supporter of it. Venezuela and Cuba and Bolivia are and yeah, CELAC is a good alternative to the Organization of American States, which has largely been a place where the United States, pushes its agenda. What can we learn from Stalin? Well, you should go watch. I made a video called "The Personality of Stalin." It's a selection from Alive where I just talked about Stalin's personality, who he was as a mass organizer. Who was Stalin? Why was Stalin successful? Why did he emerge to become the leader of the Soviet Union? Why did Stalin? Why was he able to industrialize the country? Why was he able to mobilize for the defeat of the Nazis? Why was he able to, basically turn Russia into an economic superpower? Why was he able to do all of that, right? Put your criticism aside. He did accomplish a hell of a lot, right? I mean, there would be no civil rights movement in the United States if it wasn't for Stalin. And the fact that he made the black freedom struggle in the United States, as the Cold War was going, he started highlighting like crazy the black freedom struggle. In the 1930s, Stalin made a decision to highlight the black liberation struggle, the black belt thesis. And there would be, the labor movement in the United States. Do you think that we would have ever gotten Social Security or unemployment insurance if it wasn't for Stalin? So criticize Stalin all you want, but you have to recognize that he did a lot, right? This is one of those individuals that has a big impact on history. Stalin, what can we learn from him? Stalin was a mass organizer. Stalin was a mass organizer, and he understood people. He understood his people. He was, from Georgia, Central Asian country. Trotsky baits him for this. The biography of Stalin that Trotsky published, it's called Stalin. It's by Trotsky. It actually baits him for being, quote unquote, Asiatic, right? And basically baiting him and saying that Asians are not as civilized as Westerners. But Stalin understood his people. And he understood Georgians, he understood Russians, he understood the broad masses of people. He was a mass organizer, right? Lenin had Iskra, which was the theoretical journal. Stalin was the editor of the Pravda. Pravda was the daily agitational newspaper. Stalin organized strikes. Stalin was an organizer, and he knew how to relate to people. That was the main thing. He was also the linchpin. Right? When they talk about the linchpin, what is the linchpin? What's the pin that holds everything together, right? That if you pull the linchpin out, the whole thing falls apart. Well, Stalin was the linchpin in that the Bolshevik Party seemed to have two ranks. At the top, you had all these intellectuals, Trotsky, Lenin, Bukharin, Zinoviev. And then at the rank and file, you had all these working class people who were in labor unions. The Bolsheviks organized labor unions, and the average people that were in the labor unions or in the unemployed associations or the peasant associations, right? There were two ranks. You had intellectual, rich people, and you had masses of people organized. Stalin was both. Stalin could read and write because he'd been to seminary school. Stalin was a very good speaker and writer and intellectual. But Stalin was also somebody who was from a small town. His father had been a cobbler, a bootmaker, a shoemaker. He was from they called him Country Joe. Did you know that? There's a band. I don't know if you ever heard this, but at Woodstock, one of the bands that played at Woodstock was Country Joe and the Fish, right? You ever hear of Country Joe and the Fish? Well, little known fact, Country Joe and the Fish were named after Stalin and Mao. Country Joe was Stalin's nickname because Stalin was from the country. He was Country Joe. And the fish referred to Mao because Mao, one of Mao's sayings was he said, the masses are the water and the revolutionaries are the fish. So Country Joe and the Fish, that was Stalin and Mao, right? And that's really, if you want to understand the two giant communists of the 20th century, it's Country Joe and the Fish, right? And Country Joe was a guy from the countryside who knew how to organize rural folks and ordinary people, and he held the Bolshevik Party together. He was the link between the intellectuals at the top and the broad masses at the bottom. And Mao, who was Mao? He was, the masses were the water, and Mao was the fish. So if you want to understand what makes an effective communist leader, think about Country Joe and the fish. Country Joe and the fish. There you go. Why do anti-communists talk about Dostoyevsky? Because Dostoyevsky was an anti-communist. Dostoyevsky is, it's existentialism. It's the question of free will. He wrote Crime and Punishment. He wrote a lot of different, writing, but it was about, do you have free will? And it's largely from like a questioning one's Christian faith and getting back to Christian faith perspective, right? Crime and Punishment, the novel. It's about a man who murders his landlady to prove that he has free will, and then he reacts to the guilt that he feels about murdering his landlady. He falls in love with a prostitute who is also deeply religious, and she convinces him to turn himself in. And Dostoyevsky's writing is largely very religious and Christian, but coming from the perspective of a questioner of the faith. Right, Fyodor Dostoyevsky, he's a very important writer, very respected around the world, very important Russian writer, but also very widely respected globally. Dostoyevsky, one of the great Russian writers, and his writing is very Christian-oriented. And the reason anti-communists like it so much is probably because one of the main anti-communist voices the United States promoted during the Cold War, at least the right-wing anti-communist voices that they promoted, right? There was left-wing anti-communism, Orwell, etc. But one of the main right-wing anti-communist voices the USA promoted was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And Solzhenitsyn, being a religious Orthodox Christian, Alexander Solzhenitsyn pulled a lot from Dostoyevsky. And a lot of right-wing anti-communists in the United States are religious and Christian, and Dostoyevsky is religious and Christian, and Dostoyevsky and Solzhenitsyn, Solzhenitsyn refers to Dostoyevsky, so that's what it's about. That's why it is. People that get into existentialism and all of that, get a lot out of Dostoevsky. I've never been into that school of thought. I'm not a philosopher mainly. I'm interested in politics. I'm interested in economics. I'm interested in psychology. When you start getting too far into the philosophy area, you lose me. I mean, I know my Nietzsche, I know my Hegel, I know the Marxist philosophy, but I don't get too deep into the philosophy stuff. I studied politics. And from politics, I've branched out into psychology and into economics. But if you get too far into philosophy, that's not my forte. But who knows? That may change, right? You should be constantly learning, right? I told people I play chess. I am awful at chess. I'm an awful chess player, but I force myself to play chess. Why? Because I'm bad at it. Because I know the part of my brain that is chess-oriented, spatial reasoning, strategy, etc., is weaker. And so in order to force myself to be better, it's just like going to the gym. I play chess, right? And, you should constantly be trying to make yourself better. I'll tell you, my life got so much better when I started waking up and going to sleep every night with classical music. I wake up in the morning, I put on Beethoven usually in the morning, I put on Haydn or Mozart or piano concertos when I go to sleep. Put on classical music when you wake up. Put on classical music before you go to bed. It is amazing. You're detoxifying from all the wild emotions, from advertising and everything that gets bombarded with you. Just detox with Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, Handel, Bach. I mean, it's really good for you. And my life has gotten so much better. I just take a moment every morning when I wake up and every night when I go to sleep to just detox from all the crazy, extreme Wagnerian emotions that are pumped into you in this society. Because it can be overloading, right? And if you want to keep a clear head, classical music in the morning, classical music at night, exercising, I recommend you exercise, so there you go. The person said the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, quote unquote, is revisionist. Well, look, okay, what is revisionism? I actually have a whole video. What is revisionism? Revisionism, it was a term used by Edward Bernstein, who said the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. who said we don't need a revolution and that Western capitalist countries just kind of naturally evolve into socialism. Can someone timestamp those book recommendations? Go for it. Go for it. Go for it. And if you want to cut the clip, that's great. I might, put your clip on my channel after you do it, but you're free to cut these clips. I'm not going to sue you. If you want to take a clip from this and put it on your YouTube channel, I'm not going to sue you. I'm not going to demand it be taken down. I appreciate it if you do that. Feel free to cut clips. Feel free to, put in the super chats, the timestamps. But so as far as the CPRF being revisionist, look, so the first revisionism was Edward Bernstein. It was the Second International. It was people who thought that the Western capitalist countries just kind of naturally evolve into socialism. They were pro-imperialism, etc. Then, during the Cold War, after Khrushchev was in power in the Soviet Union, you had Mao accused Khrushchev of being a modern revisionist, that he sold out the revolution. He sold out the revolution, that he didn't believe in Marxism anymore. He was revising Marxism to advance his own interests as the leader of the Soviet Union. Okay. And there's definitely criticism that can be made of Khrushchev's leadership. There's criticism that can be made of Mao's leadership. The Cultural Revolution was pretty awful in a lot of ways. Mao was aligning with the imperialists in Angola. He supported Pinochet, and there's criticism of Mao that could be made. And that I don't like to use the term revisionist. I'll just be honest. I don't like to use the term revisionist because I feel that using that word, it leads to dogmatism. It leads to dogmatism because if you use revisionist as a slur, you're basically saying you shouldn't be revising Marxism. You should not revise. That's the implication. And I don't like that because we're all revising. Lenin revised Marxism, and he said the revolution would happen in the East and in the developing world rather than in the first world in his time. Lenin was a revisionist in the literal sense of the term. Mao was a revisionist, and he said the peasantry would make the revolution in China, not the industrial workers. Thank goodness that Mao was a revisionist. Thank goodness that Lenin was a revisionist. The Bolivarians in Latin America, by building popular fronts that have been able to take power, they revised those who said you have to overthrow capitalism and set up a one-party state. Well, they revised it. And thank goodness that in Bolivia and in Venezuela and in Nicaragua, they revised Marxism to take power in their way, right? And that if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. There is no permanent way you should do things, and that if we start calling people revisionists, even though it's technically not what the term means, okay, the term has a specific meaning. However, by using that word, it leads to a mindset in which this becomes a dogma. This becomes a religion. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation is very big, and it has many different factions in it. Zhuganov, the leader of the Russian Federation, is a very big admirer of Deng Xiaoping and Deng Xiaoping theory, and a very big admirer of China. He is also an Orthodox Christian. However, there are many atheists in the Russian Communist Party, and there are many hardline Marxist-Leninists who reject Deng Xiaoping theory and don't think China is a socialist country. There are many European social democrats in the Russian Communist Party. There are many anarchists. Actually, there are anarchists, believe it or not, in the Russian Communist Party. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation is a mass party. It is not a vanguard party in the Leninist sense by any means. It is a mass party, right? It is the successor to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union is illegal, but they are the successor of it. It's a new party that was formed when Russia was formed. And from my understanding, it is not a Leninist vanguard party. It is rather a mass party. And there are many different viewpoints within it. Some which are blatantly European social democratic, some which are hardline anti-revisionist, ML. Some of, the main prevailing current is pro-Russian Orthodox Church and Christian and pro-China. That's probably the majority view in the party from what I understand, but there are many views, and they seem to be polling very well. We'll see the results of the election as they develop, but many expect they may do very well in the upcoming election. But it's complicated, right? And we will see what that means as it develops. But they are one of the, there's the United Russia Party, which is the main party. Putin's no longer a member of the United Russia Party. But it's probably the main party in Russia is called United Russia. Then there's the Communist Party. Then they're the second largest party. And then there's the Liberal Democratic Party, which is the third largest party. And then there are a number of other parties in Russia, but those are the main three parties in Russia. The CPRF is a very big party. It's a very big part of the political process in Russia. What's interesting is the people who vote for the Communist Party, generally it's older people, older folks who vote for them. Did you know that? It's older people, the ones who actually lived under the Soviet Union. Wow. Wow. All my life I've heard people, when I tell people I'm a communist, what do they say? What do they tell me? Mass versus Vanguard. What do they say when you say you're a communist? They say, oh, haven't you ever talked to anyone who actually lived under it, Caleb? Oh, I met a Cuban one time. If you ever met anyone who actually lived under communism, you would never believe in it. Well, in Russia, you know who overwhelmingly votes for the Communist Party? The people who actually lived under it. That's such an arrogant thing to say. It drives me crazy. I swear, that'd be like after the Civil War, someone says you like Lincoln. You like Abraham Lincoln? You must never have talked to Scarlett O'Hara and Captain Butler. They actually lived under Lincoln, Caleb. You must never have watched Birth of a Nation. You must never have watched Gone with the Wind. Haven't you talked to anyone who actually lived under Abraham Lincoln? There's one side of the story, folks. One side of the story. Haven't you ever listened to the night they drove old Dixie down, Caleb? Haven't you ever listened to the night they drove old Dixie down? Come on. There is multiple sides to the story, and the people who actually lived under it, the older folks in Russia, are the ones who vote for the Communist Party. And in every former Soviet country, poll after poll after poll after poll comes out, and people say that life was better before the fall of the Soviet Union. Poll after poll after poll. And anti-communists talk about this. And it is just a fact. Soviet nostalgia, admiration for Stalin is very widespread in Russia. It's very widespread in surrounding countries. So people who tell you that, if you ever talk to anyone who ever lived on it, that is the height of U.S.-centric thinking. It's this arrogance. Yes, people in the United States who actually lived under it, yes, they have a certain perspective. You betcha. The Miami Cuban that you met, the person who fled to the United States in the 1980s or whatever, yeah, they're going to have one perspective, but there are many views. All right, the next question is, what is a dirty war? Well, the term dirty war, right? And it's points to the irony of, it almost reminds you, there's a movie called Dr. Strangelove, a classic American film. It's like there's a nuclear disaster going on, and so they bring the Russian ambassador into the Pentagon, and he's got a picture, or he's got a camera, and so one of the generals is kind of scuffling with the Russian general, and so the president of the United States says to the Russian general, to the Russian ambassador and the general who are fighting, he says, "You can't fight in here. This is the war room," right? Like all war is dirty, right? All war is dirty. All war is ugly. All war is vicious. Okay. That said, there are things like the Geneva Convention. There are different treaties that have been signed that say one is expected. There are things that are called war crimes, right? Urban decay and the ghost towns of former Soviet countries. I don't know anything about that, Kieran. I don't know anything about those things. But, there are things that are called war crimes, okay? Right? Chemical weapons, right? The Geneva Convention bans the use of chemical weapons. You're not supposed to use chemical weapons, right? Well, there's this Geneva Convention that says it is illegal to use chemical weapons in modern warfare. And as a result of that, when people use them, they say, well, that they're waging a dirty war because they're using chemical weapons. Well, the Syrian rebels have been using chemical weapons since day one. The Syrian government is accused of it. There's controversy, but everybody knows the Syrian rebels are using it. And, al-Nusra and the Syrian rebels are using chemical weapons, and no one seems to, that doesn't get brought up. Another thing, the Geneva Convention generally refers to how when soldiers are captured, right? Prisoners of war are not supposed to be treated like regular prisoners, right? They're supposed to be allowed to wear their military uniforms, not prison uniforms, or civilian clothes or their military uniforms, not prison uniforms. They're allowed to have like ranks in the prisoner of war camp and such. There are certain ways you treat prisoners of war, right? The Geneva Convention, right, is generally the rules of warfare. If we're going to have a war, we have to fight it this way, is the idea. So if you're fighting a dirty war, you're in theory violating the rules of war. You're using chemical weapons. You're torturing prisoners. That's generally what that refers to. What makes this all complicated is that the USA has not actually formally declared war on any country since the Second World War. Every war we've had has been an intervention. It has been a military, it's never been considered a war. We have not formally had a war. So none of this applies according to US law, right? We haven't had a war in the United States since World War II. We've just had military interventions. We've just had Operation Desert Storm. It's never considered to be a war. So because of that, because it's not considered to be a war, technically the USA doesn't hold itself to the Geneva Convention in these wars, right? Guantanamo Bay. Those are not prisoners of war, right? They're considered to be terrorists. They're enemy combatants, but they're not considered enemies. The Geneva Convention doesn't apply to them because they're not considered to be prisoners of war. Yeah, and so it's like the way all of this works, it shows that at the end of the day, this is all just kind of a game. There's a professor, it's a legal game that basically they do what they want to do. They invent the legal language around it to do it. There was a professor, John Yoo, who was at Berkeley, who was arguing that you could that the torture was allowed and things like that. And he was making legal arguments, right? And Gina Haspel and all that this is the game that they play, right? Is that they want to do some things and they hire a couple lawyers to reinterpret some international documents to say they're allowed to do it. I'm not a legal scholar, but I have a feeling Guantanamo Bay is completely a violation of international law. Does that stop the United States from doing it? No. No. I interviewed a lawyer who represented, I interviewed one of the most famous lawyers in the United States about the Alex Saab case and about Guantanamo Bay. Chelsea Manning's lawyer. I interviewed her, and she described what has gone on at Guantanamo Bay. The very gross details. Pumping hummus into people. She describes in very gross detail what they were doing at Guantanamo Bay, right? There's no way that's not a huge violation of international law. But they hire these Pentagon lawyers and they reinterpret, what it means. So, yeah, there you go. Okay. A mass party versus a vanguard party. Well, right, so this gets back to Lenin's theory of the party of new type, right? That, the Bolsheviks were a party of new type, right? They were a party of people who gave the whole of their lives and engage in democratic centralism, right? Whereas a mass party is a party that anyone can join as long as they agree with certain principles. The Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party are mass parties. The Communist Party, the Workers' World Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, these are vanguard parties because they practice democratic centralism. That's the difference. Democratic centralism, which is this Leninist party mobilization that there is broad discussion within the party, but once a decision is reached at that point, then every member is obligated to carry it out. That disagreements in the party are kept internal. There is one party line presented to the masses that all members are required to publicly say, and fights are kept internal in a vanguard party. There's the democratic centralist process through which decisions are made, and then all members are obligated to carry out those decisions whether they agree or disagree. And that's the theory of the party of new type, and that vanguard parties, or cadre parties as they're sometimes called, and you can't be a member of it unless you're willing to give the whole of your life, right? You should give the whole of your life. Your job that you have is just considered to be, if you have a job, you're just paying the bills. You're a full-time revolutionary. It's just this thing you do to pay the bills. You are a full-time professional revolutionary. It's being in the army. It's like being in the military or something, right? When you join a vanguard party. I was a member of a vanguard party for many years, and honestly, it was a little looser than most vanguard formulations are. Yeah, it's like being in the military. I mean, it's like, they move you from city to city, they tell you where to go, they set the party line, and, that's a Leninist vanguard party, whereas a mass party is just a party that you agree with their principles and you join, right? Honestly, I don't think democratic centralism has worked out too well in the United States over the past 100 years. The Communist Party was very effective. It was democratic centralist. Um, the Black Panthers were very effective. They were a democratic centralist organization. But aside from them, we've got a million little tiny cults in the United States. These little tiny political cults. It's one or two people's ego trip, and we need to rethink it. I'm not building a party right now. I'm building a think tank, an educational socialist think tank. It's not a pre-party formation. It's not aligned with any party. I mean, I work with people, some of whom are in the Communist Party, some of whom are in the Party of Communists, some of whom are in the PSL, some of whom are in the Rayo Light Group, the Revolutionary Organization of Labor, some of whom who are in the, there's different people who've been around different groups, and the Center for Political Innovation is not a party. It's a think tank that engages in socialist education. That's what I think we need right now. That's what's missing. There is not widespread spreading of socialist consciousness in the United States. So that's the role that I can play, right? I've decided my duty. I must decide and do it well. And that's what I think needs to be done. And if you want to do that with me, by all means, I'm here. You can join the Center for Political Innovation. You can join our Zoom calls that we have. You can come to our conferences we're having around the country. You can, help us. You could become a John Brown volunteer. You could join Students and Youth for a New America on your campuses. We need people. We need people to join the city building tendency. But we're not a democratic centralist organization, right? We don't require you to, repeat our line on the internet. If you don't agree with something in this book, that's fine. You're allowed to say it. We're not obligating anyone to do anything. If we vote to have a conference in Milwaukee and you don't want to go, no one's going to make you go. We're not a democratic centralist group. And I think that, democratic centralism in the United States, the way it has been implemented, has been a little bit problematic. It's not to say that there might not be aspects of it that would be worth implementing later at some other point, but I think democratic centralism has led to a lot of sectarianism on the U.S. left, and it's led to circumstances where people can't work with each other. It's led to isolating the U.S. left from the broad masses. So that's my feeling. We need to rethink it, right? If the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. It's very clear that democratic centralism worked out very well in Russia in 1903 when it was invented, and in 1917 when the Bolsheviks took power. But this is the United States, well over 100 years later, so maybe we should be reconsidering the organizing methods, because we have a million democratic centralist parties, and none of them seem to be getting to the masses and bringing forth revolution. And, I was in a group for many years that was a Leninist vanguard party, and it took me a while. I was kind of in denial for a long time, but I realized they were never going to expand. They were never going to grow. And that was actually one of the greatest fears that the people of the group had. The leaders had the fear that it would actually grow, and that would mean they would lose their control, right? It was the ego trip of a few people. It was a few people's protest hustle. They were afraid that it would grow beyond their control. And, and that's the problem. As quote unquote, the struggle advances, as conditions change, the methods of organizing will also have to change. I am building a think tank because I think it needs to be done, and it can be done. That's what I can do now. I'm not a member of any party. I engage in socialist education. I'm not an activist, not an organizer. I'm just an educator. I am a socialist educator. I'm on here educating you about socialism, answering your questions. That's what I can do. And we are moving ahead. I mean, the reading groups around the country, the John Brown volunteer full-time outreach team, we're getting a lot of stuff done, and it's really beautiful. So I'm really happy with what we're doing. We're moving ahead. There you go. And I'll just keep doing these streams, keep writing these books. A new book will be out next week. Fingers crossed. Can't wait to see it. It'll be out pretty soon. I'm sure it'll cause a stir. It's meant to. It's meant to cause a stir. There you go. All right, folks. I think we're going to end it here. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Bye-bye.